In 1946, in the quiet town of Spring Hollow, two young sisters vanished without a trace. Authorities moved on. The town stayed silent, but their little brother never did. 4 decades later, his relentless search unearthed a chilling truth. Buried deep beneath the woods, what he discovered would tear open a past the town had tried desperately to forget. The summer of 1946 in Spring Hollow was thick with the scent of pine sap and heat-baked gravel, the kind of warmth that lulled even the most restless souls into a daze. It was the sort of quiet that felt permanent. Rachel Monroe, 17 and sharp as the edge of her late mother's sewing scissors, leaned on the wooden fence behind the old general store, squinting against the morning sun. Her younger sister, Lena, only 14 but always a step ahead in mischief, was perched beside her with a small smirk. "We'll be back before dinner. Nobody's going to miss us for a few hours," Rachel murmured, checking the paper bag tied at the top with twine. Inside were clothes not meant for a simple visit, skirts too short, lipstick stolen from their aunt's drawer, and a small stash of cash they had been saving in a jar marked movie fun. Their father, Joseph Monroe, a quiet widower and part-time lumberjack, had left early that morning to haul timber down to Vesper Hill. He wouldn't return until dusk. It was the perfect window. "So we're really doing this?" Lena asked, her eyes darting toward the old road that cut through the woods and curved into the hills beyond. "We're not just doing this," Rachel replied. "We're finally leaving this hole of a town. If Marchie can do it, so can we." The plan was simple. Get to Rockmore, meet up with Eddie, a boy Rachel had been writing to in secret, and figure it out from there. Rockmore had buses, diners, and jobs. It had noise. It had life. They left at 9:13 a.m. A neighbor, Mrs. Ellery, later said she saw them skipping across the Monroes' front yard, laughing like nothing in the world could touch them. Rachel wore a pale blue dress. Lena wore her boots, an old pair, worn smooth at the toes but still sturdy. They took the dirt trail behind the orchard that connected Spring Hollow to the outskirts of Rockmore. They took the dirt trail much used except by hunters and wanderers. In midway, the woods thickened. Birds quieted. The sun filtered through the canopy in blades of gold. It was the last place they were ever seen. When they didn't return for supper, their father assumed they'd stayed late at Marcy's. By nightfall, concerned to fear, by the next morning every house within 10 miles had heard of the missing Monroe sisters. Sheriff Will Crane organized a search party, more out of duty than hope. Over the next 3 days, they combed the trail, the woods, the abandoned shacks near Pickers Creek. They found nothing until the 4th day. It was just after dawn when old Levi Thornton, a trapper, stumbled upon a single boot, Lena's. It was lodged in the mud by the river bend, the leather torn, the side caked in dried blood. But there were no footprints, no drag marks, just silence and a sickening emptiness. Rachel's name was carved faintly into the inside flap of her satchel, found near a collapsed log a few yards away. The other boot never found. No bodies, no signs of struggle. The case went from urgent to speculative. Locals whispered about wild animals, runaway lovers, even spirits in the trees. But Joseph Monroe didn't believe in superstition. His hand shook every time he tried to light his pipe. Every morning he'd walk to the river bend and sit beside the spot where they'd found Lena's boot. By week 2, state police were involved. Rockmore authorities interrogated half the county. Some reported seeing a gray pickup truck with no plates heading south along Dust Hill Road the same day. Others swore they heard screams late that night. But nothing stuck. The trail ran cold. The girls had simply vanished. At the Monroe home, the girls' room remained untouched. Rachel's comb still had strands of her auburn hair. Lena's sketchbook sat open on her desk, half-finished doodles of girls in dresses and road signs pointing to cities she'd never reach. Joseph refused to let anyone enter. He'd sit on the porch, shotgun across his knees, eyes sunken, watching the path they took that morning. Rumors began to fester. Some believed the sisters had plotted their escape, left of their own will. Others were crueler, suggesting Joseph himself knew more than he claimed. A reporter from the Vesper Times wrote a column titled "Gone Girls or Ghosts?" casting doubt on the family. The community began to shift, from grief to distance. The house on Birch Lane became one people crossed the street to avoid. 6 months passed, then a year. Search parties dwindled, the sheriff's updates became less frequent, and eventually the Monroes' tragedy became a campfire tale for children who'd never known the girls. "Don't wander past the orchard," they'd whisper. Rachel and Lena never came back. Joseph never moved, never remarried, never stopped waiting. And in time, even Spring Hollow forgot the sound of the sisters' laughter. But the dirt trail remembered. It was the 7th morning since the Monroe sisters had vanished, and the air in Spring Hollow had shifted. What began as whispers behind fences had now spread into full-blown rumors rolling down Main Street like tumbleweeds. Sheriff Will Crane stood at the edge of Picker's Field, arms crossed over his thick chest, watching a group of volunteers kick through the tall grass. His eyes were bloodshot, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of leading a search that seemed more hopeless with every passing day. That's when Amos Brewster, a reclusive farmer from the west side of town, approached with a story that would reignite the case with terrifying clarity. Amos claimed that on the morning the girls disappeared, he saw them walking down the dirt road near his property, giggling and pushing each other like they didn't have a care in the world. What made his claim different, however, was what came next. Around 10:30 a.m., he said, a gray pickup truck pulled over just past the Miller's orchard. The girls paused, spoke briefly to the driver, and then climbed into the truck bed like it was something they'd done before. Amos couldn't see the man clearly from his field, but he noted the truck had no license plate and was headed south, away from Rockmore, deeper into the unincorporated stretches between counties. Sheriff Crane scribbled details in his notebook, but didn't react much until Amos added one more chilling detail. "I think that was Jimmy Harrow's truck, or what used to be his. Gray, rust on the fenders, no plates. And I'll bet you anything, it was him driving." Jimmy Harrow was a name that sent a particular kind of chill through the older folks in town. A mechanic by trade, Harrow had always walked the line between strange and dangerous. 10 years prior, he'd been quietly investigated after a 16-year-old waitress from the diner accused him of following her home. No charges were ever filed, but he'd kept his reputation, someone you avoided after dark. Crane knew he had to act fast. They found Harrow at the back of his garage on Hollow Street, working under a Chevy Impala with a cigarette hanging from his lips. When questioned, Jimmy didn't blink. "Haven't seen those girls," he said flatly. "Ain't picked up no one in years." But he did own a gray pickup, claimed it was parked in the back lot behind the garage and hadn't run in months. Sheriff Crane had it towed and inspected. The truck's back panel had faint traces of mud. One of the tires had fresh scuff marks. Forensics in 1946 wasn't what it is now, but the sheriff had a gut feeling, and it pointed hard toward Jimmy. They brought Harrow in for questioning. Under pressure, he admitted to being on Dust Hill Road that morning, but claimed he was test driving a customer's car. He even provided a name, Mr. Carl Tandy, a retired miner from Rockmore who did, in fact, confirm that Jimmy had dropped off his wife's Buick that afternoon. Carl also claimed he'd seen Jimmy at 11:45 a.m. drinking lemonade on his front porch. That timeline placed Jimmy far from where the girls were last seen. Crane didn't like it, but the alibi was tight. The state investigator brought in from Dunsley reviewed the facts, poked holes in Amos Brewster's statement. The man's practically blind without his glasses, and within 3 days, Jimmy Harrow was cleared. No charges, no follow-up, just a quiet release, and a quiet town growing more unsettled. After 3 weeks, the sheriff's office issued an update. There had been no credible sightings, no new evidence. The Monroe girls, they said, may have left on their own accord. Sheriff Crane read the statement himself outside the courthouse, his voice like gravel. "We believe it's possible that Rachel and Lena Monroe voluntarily left their home, perhaps to seek a new life. We believe it's possible that Rachel and Lena Monroe volunteered their home. We closing the formal search, pending new information." A few people gasped, others just turned away. Joseph Monroe didn't show up. He stayed at home, seated in the same porch chair where he had sat every evening since they disappeared. His face was now hollowed, lined with silence. In the following days, posters were taken down. Search dogs returned to their kennels. The volunteers stopped coming. Local papers ran other stories. By the start of August, it was as if the Monroe sisters had never existed outside the walls of their family's house. But the town wasn't done whispering. The theories bred like flies in summer heat. Some believed the girls had gotten mixed up with bootleggers heading west. Others swore they'd seen Rachel on the back of a Harley weeks later in Grayson County, her hair dyed black. A woman came forward claiming she'd had a vision of the girls near Mirror Lake. It was all noise, none of it useful. Mark Monroe was barely a toddler then, too young to understand why his sisters' names made adults pause. But he would remember the way his father's hand trembled when someone mentioned Dust Hill Road. He would remember how the town looked the other way whenever his father walked into a store, and he would remember the silence, thick as syrup, that coated their house like dust. Nothing was ever found again. Not a thread, not a button, not a scrap of hair. It was like Spring Hollow had swallowed the Monroe girls whole and spat out nothing but questions. Amos Brewster died 2 years later in a barn fire. Jimmy Harrow moved out of town, headed west. Joseph Monroe stopped answering the door altogether. And then, one afternoon, nearly a decade after the case went cold, a stranger passed through Spring Hollow on a motorcycle and left behind something strange. An envelope with no return address, slipped under the sheriff's door. Inside was a photograph. 2 young girls sitting at a diner booth, one with a bob raise, one with braids, both looking toward the camera. On the back, Rockmore, June 1946. But by then, no one was looking anymore. 8 months had passed since the morning Rachel and Lena disappeared, and Spring Hollow had all but moved on. The Monroe house, however, remained frozen in time, suspended between grief and something darker, something unspoken. The curtains just at Hollow, just like Joseph Monroe, no longer worked. He didn't speak to neighbors, didn't visit the sheriff's office. He simply existed, moving between the front porch and the girls' room like a ghost bound to 2 anchors. But it was Emily Monroe, the girl's mother, who wore the silence most heavily. At first she had been the one holding it all together, delivering meals to Joseph, brushing Mark's hair with trembling hands, folding Rachel's dresses and placing them into sealed boxes she could not bring herself to tape shut. But grief was not a tide for her, it was a stone lodged in her lungs. She barely slept. She stopped cooking. Some days she simply sat in the kitchen staring at the wall. Then came the letter. It was a Wednesday in early March. The weather had warmed slightly, a teasing taste of spring that settled over the hollow like a sigh. That afternoon, Joseph returned from the store to find the house eerily quiet. Mark, then not even 3 years old, was asleep on the living room rug. The back door was ajar, swinging gently, and in the bathtub upstairs, Emily's body lay still, her wrists open, the water a cloudy red. There was no note beside her, no dramatic scrawl on the mirror, just a sealed envelope propped against the family Bible on the hallway table. Inside, on a single piece of lined paper, she had written, "I can't carry this secret anymore. I thought silence would protect us. I was wrong. Forgive me. Forgive me." No name, no details, just an overwhelming sense of guilt that wrapped around her last words like a noose. The town, once again, descended into murmurs. Some speculated Emily had lost her mind. Others wondered what secret could be so unbearable it would drive a mother to leave her son behind, alone with a man already broken. The funeral was small. A few relatives from Dunsless came. Joseph stood motionless the entire service. Afterward, he refused to speak of her. Mark would later say he never saw his father cry. Not once. A week later, the family attorney arrived to settle Emily's estate. Among her belongings was a small cedar chest that no one had touched in years. It contained family photos, keepsakes, and a thin black album that had been wrapped tightly in muslin cloth. Tucked inside the back cover of the album, behind a faded Valentine's Day card, was a photograph unlike any other. Rachel stood in a doorway, one hand gripping the frame, her other arm around the waist of a man at least 3 times her age. She wore a dark fitted dress, high heels, lipstick. Not the Rachel from Spring Hollow, the girl with scraped knees and ink on her fingers, but someone older, posed, and almost unrecognizable. The man beside her was gaunt, with deep lines across his cheeks and a crooked smile. His eyes were turned slightly away from the camera. There was no caption, no date, just a tiny X drawn in blue pen above Rachel's shoulder. Joseph took the photo, stared at it for hours, then placed it back inside the album and locked it away. He told no one. Mark, too young to understand its meaning at the time, would later find it again when he was 15, tucked inside a box labeled tax records. When he asked his father about it, Joseph simply said, "Some things don't need remembering." But others did remember. Lacey from the post office swore she once saw Rachel getting into a black sedan months before she vanished, wearing lipstick and a scarf. The diner waitress said Rachel had been meeting someone every Thursday afternoon, an older man with gray hair and expensive boots. At the time, no one thought much of it. After all, Rachel was beautiful, ambitious. Maybe she had secrets. But looking back, it all seemed like pieces to a puzzle no one had dared assemble. By early summer, Joseph began disappearing for days at a time. He would return smelling of whiskey, clothes stained with dirt, his eyes red and glazed. Once he came back with blood on his collar, another time with a broken hand. Mark learned not to ask questions. The townsfolk had stopped doing so long ago. To them, the Monroe family was a tragedy best left untouched. But inside that house, something festering had taken root, something that creaked louder than the floorboards and settled deeper than grief. Then came the summer of 1947. Mark, now almost 4, wandered into the attic while his father was away. He had been chasing a moth, the kind that danced in the light like paper. There, in a trunk marked Emily's Things, he found the album again. Flipping through the pages, he paused at the photo, the one with Rachel and the strange man. And for the first time, something about the man's stance struck him as familiar. The slouch, the way his arm curved protectively, almost possessively. It reminded him of a man who once came to the house, not long before the girls disappeared, a supposed cousin from out of state who'd brought Rachel a gift and whispered something into Emily's ear that made her flinch. Mark didn't know the name. He didn't even remember the voice. But something deep inside him twisted. He placed the photo back and descended the stairs without a word. The silence in the house welcomed him like an old friend. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's archives, a letter from 1945 sat buried under unrelated files. It was a report submitted by Emily Monroe herself, anonymous, unsigned, but in her handwriting, accusing a man of inappreciated conduct toward her daughter. The letter never led to an investigation. It was marked unfounded, and the man's name was blacked out in red ink. Sheriff Crane never followed up. Whether out of oversight, fear, or something else entirely, no one knew. That letter would not be found again for nearly 4 decades, but the photograph remained, its glossy surface aging slowly in the attic heat, waiting for someone to ask the right question, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what it had been trying to say all along. And while the world outside the Monroe home turned toward post-war prosperity, Spring Hollow kept its secrets close, layered beneath years of quiet decay and unanswered prayers. Emily's suicide became another faded footnote in the town's memory, the kind no one brought up over dinner. But in the corner of the family album, behind that one photograph, a piece of paper had curled in, its edges curling, its ink nearly faded. On it, scribbled in the same blue pen as the X on Rachel's shoulder, were 2 words that would eventually bring everything back to life. He knew. The years following Emily's death were marked by a silence even deeper than before. Joseph Monroe, once a reserved but functional man, seemed to unravel at the seams. After burying his wife in the small, unmarked plot beside the churchyard, he returned home and closed every curtain, locked every door, and spoke to no one. Mark, barely 5, watched his father retreat inward like a man sinking into wet concrete. The house grew colder, not from the weather, but from the absence of light, laughter, and life. Rachel and Lena's room remained sealed. The attic, where the mysterious photograph remained hidden, was nailed shut. Joseph stopped shaving, stopped attending church, and stopped speaking altogether. Neighbors saw him occasionally pacing the yard, his boots dragging like they were made of stone. Then, one morning in early spring of 1950, he was gone. It was a Thursday. The mailman noted that Joseph's truck was still in the driveway, keys hanging inside the ignition. His coat was draped over the back of the dining chair. On the stove, a kettle had boiled itself dry, the metal scorched black. The only sign of movement was in the barn, where a door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. When the sheriff's deputy went to investigate, he found nothing unusual, at first. The stalls were empty. Dust floated in sunbeams that pierced the gaps in the wood. But in the corner, behind a stack of rotting hay, was an old leather suitcase. It was cracked at the seams, the handle missing. Inside were folded papers, some yellowed with age, some crisp and new. Among them was a birth certificate labeled Lena Monroe, but the date was wrong by 2 years, and the listed mother was a woman named Eliza Jean Carter from Missouri. It bore an official seal, but no one in town had ever heard of Eliza Jean. The handwriting matched that of a known forger from the neighboring county, but he had died in 1949. Alongside the certificate were train tickets to Kansas City, unused and dated January 5, 1950. Joseph Monroe had left no note, no final words. He simply vanished, leaving behind a suitcase of questions and a house filled with ghosts. After a brief and reluctant investigation, authorities declared Joseph missing and presumed deceased. The property was turned over to Emily's parents, the Renfros, who had never approved of Joseph but took in young Mark out of obligation. They sold the Monroe house to a couple from out of state, who would later claim the Adam from Nightmares, until they nailed it shut for good. Mark was moved to the Renfro home on the outskirts of Spring Hollow, a modest farmhouse lined with picket fences and thick with silence. There, under the strict eye of his grandfather, George Renfro, a stoic man of few words, Mark began a new life, built on denial. The names Rachel and Lena were forbidden in that house. Emily was referred to only as your mother. Joseph's name was never uttered again. At dinner, if Mark ever asked where his father had gone, George would slam his fork down and leave the table. His grandmother Mabel would squeeze his hand beneath the tablecloth and whisper, "Some things are better left alone." As he grew, Mark learned the unspoken rules. Don't ask questions. Don't wonder. Don't talk about the past. At school, he kept his head low and his words fewer. Other children sometimes whispered about his family, the Monroe girls, the curse of that house. One boy threw a stone at him once and yelled, "Your daddy buried them in the barn." The teacher never intervened. Mark stopped playing outside. After that, in the attic of the Renfro house, there were boxes labeled with dates and names. Mark would sneak up there sometimes, heart pounding, hoping to find something, anything, that could connect him to the sisters he only remembered in fragments. Lena's laugh echoing down the hallway, Rachel reading aloud in a sunlit room, but the boxes were filled with old tax documents, farm receipts, and tattered hymnals. Nothing of value, nothing of memory. It was as if they had never existed. But Mark remembered the suitcase in the barn. He would think about it often, especially at night, imagining his father clutching it in the dark, wrestling with a decision he could not make. He wondered who Eliza Jean Carter was. He wondered what a forged birth certificate meant, and he wondered why no one had ever questioned any of it. By the time Mark turned 16, he had developed a quiet obsession with missing persons cases. He borrowed books from the county library, clipped newspaper stories, and filled a notebook with scribbles, timelines, and questions. But he never spoke of the Monroe girls. He never dared. It wasn't until his grandfather passed in 1967 and his grandmother was moved to a care home that Mark returned to the old Monroe property. The house had changed hands several times, and the barn was now leaning, nearly collapsed. But the field behind it remained the same, long grass swaying in a wind that smelled like rain and memory. Standing there, Mark could almost hear their voices again. He could see their shadows darting between trees. He could feel the questions pressing against his chest like stones. He walked to the back of the barn, to the exact corner where the suitcase had been found. The floor was soft, rotting in places. He knelt, pressing his hand into the dirt, and imagined the weight of that case, the crispness of the forged paper, the panic that must have crept into his father's veins. Had Joseph tried to hide them, protect them, cover something up? Or was he simply running from a truth he couldn't face? He stayed there until dusk, the sky painting itself in bruised purples and ash, and just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a glint beneath the floorboards, a sliver of metal barely visible. He knelt again, fingers scraping at the splintered wood, pulling at the soft earth beneath. The glint disappeared, but something else revealed itself, a small corner of fabric, blue and frayed, wedged between two beams. Mark's hands shook as he reached for it, heart thudding like a drum in a canyon. The earth around him seemed to hush, the wind pausing in anticipation. And for the first time in years, he felt something other than silence. He felt proximity. Not to answers, not yet, but to something buried, something left behind. By the winter of 1985, Mark Monroe had returned to Spring Hollow not as the quiet boy people remembered, but as a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly when holding on to the past. He had lived a scattered life, drifting from job to job, town to town, never settling long enough to forget, never moving far enough to escape. When his grandmother Mabel passed away in December, the farmhouse that once suffocated him with silence became his responsibility. The land was brittle, the porch sagged, and the paint peeled in long curls like dead skin. He hadn't stepped inside since 1972, when he'd left Spring Hollow for good, or so he'd thought. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he unlocked the door. The air inside was cold and sour, thick with the smell of old linens and forgotten memories. Furniture stood where it had always stood, untouched. The table still bore faint rings from glasses long gone. Dust coated everything like a second skin. Mark didn't plan to stay long, just long enough to sort through the belongings, call an estate agent, and disappear again. But on the second day of cleaning, while sweeping near the kitchen hearth, his foot hit something hollow. A loose floorboard. At first he dismissed it, just age, rot, but curiosity had always been a splinter in his mind, and this time it lodged deep. He pried the board up with the claw end of a hammer and discovered a metal lockbox wedged between the joists. It was rusted shut, no key in sight. After an hour of struggling, he broke it open with brute force and found inside a folded towel, yellowed with age, wrapped tightly around a leather-bound notebook and a small tin of faded photographs. The notebook was thick, the pages warped, the corners chewed slightly by time. On the first page, in neat, unmistakable cursive, it read, "Property of Emily Monroe, R. his mother's nursing journal." Mark sat on the floor, legs crossed like a boy again, and began to read. The entries were clinical at first, routine cases from her work at the Spring Hollow Clinic, notes about local children with fever, elderly patients with failing lungs, a rash of injuries during harvest. But as he flipped forward, the tone shifted. Her writing grew looser, the margins more crowded with anxious scribbles. Dates became more specific. In 1946, May 1946. Then, in an entry dated June 3, 1946, the ink smeared slightly but legible, was a note that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. Rachel, confirmed, 4 months pregnant, no father listed, emotional state unstable, refuses to name him, suspect coercion. Mark reread the lines, heart pounding. Pregnant? 4 months. That would have meant Rachel conceived sometime in February. They disappeared in June. He flicked back through earlier pages, looking for any mention of this. There was nothing until March, vague references to mood swings, headaches, and frequent nausea. Emily had known. She had written it all down and told no one except maybe Joseph. The idea wrapped around Mark's spine like a vice. Had his father known? Had his mother's silence been part of some terrible protection, or worse, complicity? He looked at the tin of photos. Most were ordinary family shots in black and white. Church picnics, Mark as a toddler beside a small tricycle, Rachel standing near the porch with a hand shielding her eyes. But near the bottom was a picture he hadn't seen before. Rachel again, this time in profile, her stomach slightly rounded, her dress loose, but unable to conceal what he now recognized. She was staring off camera, her hand on the railing of what looked like a porch, but not the one from their house. The background was unfamiliar. Mark turned it over. On the back, in faint pencil, was written, May 46, R. No other note. He stared at the image for a long time. Rachel had been pregnant. Emily had documented it, hidden it, and then died, leaving behind only riddles. The suicide note now echoed louder in his head. The secret hadn't just been their disappearance, it was what happened before. Who the father was, why Rachel refused to name him, why her mother took it to her grave. Mark stood slowly, the notebook pressed against his chest. The house seemed to pulse around him, every creak of the floorboards now suspect, every shadow waited. He needed answers. The next morning he drove into town, notebook in hand. The Spring Hollow Clinic had been closed since the late 70s, boarded up and weather-beaten, but the town archive office next door was still open. He walked in, asked for any medical staff records from 19451946, and waited as the clerk asking about those years, she said, handing him a small stack, lots of gaps, unfortunately. Mark nodded, thumbing through names, until one stood out. Dr. Vernon Ellis, head physician during the war, and a man whose name he vaguely remembered from hushed conversations in his youth. A note beside his file said, "Retired to Rockmore, 1950. Mark drove there that afternoon, nerves riding shotgun. Rockmore had grown since his childhood visits, new buildings, new faces, but the Ellis house still stood, a gray colonial on Birch Avenue. He didn't expect the doctor to be alive, but a neighbor watering her plants confirmed otherwise. "He's 98, she said, still sharp when he wants to be." He squinted at Mark, then at the notebook. "Emily Monroe," he said slowly. "Yes, I remember her. Smart girl. Quiet." He stopped there, shaking his head. So much was hidden back then. Mark left with more questions than answers. He sat in his car for hours, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Someone important, someone local, someone his mother feared enough to take the truth with her. But who? That night, back at the farmhouse, Mark flipped through the notebook again. At the very back, on the inside cover, he found a name scribbled in fading pencil, nearly invisible under the fold. The letters meant nothing at first, but then they burned into his brain like a brand. Rufus Haynes, a name he hadn't heard in decades. A man his grandfather once called untouchable. A man with money, land, and a house near the edge of Spring Hollow. A man who, in 1946, had been 37 years old, unmarried, and notoriously fond of visiting the clinic on behalf of his workers. Mark sat up straight, every cell in his body pulsing. The initials R. Hay burned through Mark's thoughts like wildfire, and though he had no direct proof, every instinct told him the name matched someone he had tried to forget. Rufus Haynes, a man whose presence in Spring Hollow loomed larger than any statue. Rufus had been a towering figure in the county's politics during the 1940s, a landowner, philanthropist, and former state deputy known equally for his influence and former murderers that clung to him like smoke. Mark remembered whispers from his grandfather, occasional warnings from townsfolk, and a certain look his mother used to give when his name was brought up at church socials, a mix of caution and dread. Mark drove back to Spring Hollow the next day and began asking questions, starting with the town records office. He discovered that the land behind the Miller Orchard, where the deed showed he'd acquired it in 1942 and quietly sold it off in 1951 after a brief and unexplained police interest. That timing, too perfect to ignore, sent a chill through Mark's spine. He needed someone who'd been there, someone who might still remember the shadows behind the files. That's how he found Mary Devlin. Mary had been a nurse's assistant at the Spring Hollow Clinic from 1943 to 1947, working under Dr. Vernon Ellis and alongside Emily Monroe. She now lived in a retirement home in Dunsley, and when Mark introduced himself, she paused only a moment before nodding. "Emily's boy," she said. "I always wondered what happened to you." Mark told her everything he had found, the notebook, the photograph, the initials, and she listened with the kind of stillness that came from long-buried pain. Then, slowly, she leaned in and said, "She tried to report him, you know. Your mother, Emily. She was terrified, but she came to me one night and said, 'Mary, if something happens to me, don't let them forget what he did to my daughter.'" Mary described a night in late May 1946, just weeks before Rachel and Lena disappeared. Emily had come to her pale and trembling, holding a sealed envelope. She said she had written everything down, details, names, dates, and planned to send it to the state attorney's office. But 2 days later, a black sedan had pulled into the clinic's gravel lot. Rufus Haynes stepped out and asked to speak with Emily in private. Mary never heard what was said, but when Emily returned, she was white as a sheet. "That envelope was never mailed." "She told me Rufus warned her," Mary said that if she made noise, bad things might happen, not just to her, but to her kids. Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him. This wasn't just rumor anymore, this was threat, this was coercion, this was fear in its rawest form. He asked Mary why she never came forward. Her hand, frail and trembling, rested in her lap. "Because I was scared too. Rufus had people everywhere, the sheriff, the council, even the preacher, some said. We were just women, Mark. Nobody would have listened." He asked if she remembered anything else, anything that could tie Rufus directly to Rachel. She nodded. "He used to come into the clinic on Thursdays. Said it was for blood pressure checks. Always asked for Rachel. She was just volunteering then, filing papers, but he insisted she bring the forms to his car personally. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Her voice trailed off into silence. Mark left the retirement home with more than he'd bargained for. He drove back into Spring Hollow and parked near the old Orchard Road. The area was fenced now, wild with overgrowth, but he walked along the perimeter, trying to envision the scene from 1946. Where had Lena's boot been found? Where had they gone after stepping into that truck? If Rufus had been involved, where would he have taken them? The thought struck him suddenly. Rufus owned a private hunting cabin deep in the woods, past Dust Hill Road. Mark remembered it only vaguely from childhood, a place his grandfather called the Fortress. It wasn't listed on any public maps. He needed proof. He needed to connect Rufus to something tangible. Back at the county archive, Mark dug deeper. In a sealed 1948 police file marked Internal Correspondence, he found an unsigned complaint that mentioned Haynes. It was thin, typed on old carbon copy paper, and referenced a pattern of disappearing native girls, suggesting possible trafficking routes through rural properties. One passage mentioned the exact plot near the orchard. The file had been marked unsubstantiated and shelved. No investigation followed. Rufus Haynes had never been questioned, never charged, never even named in public. But there it was, in black and white, buried under 40 years of bureaucracy. Mark now had 3 points of connection: the land, the clinic visits, and the warning given to his mother. All roads pointed to Rufus. He brought the documents to a retired reporter from the Vesper Times, a man named Gerald Pike, who had spent decades chasing leads that never made it past editors too scared to publish. Pike, gaunt and gray, read the materials with narrowed eyes. "I tried to go after Rufus once," he said, "back in '51, but every door slammed shut. But maybe you'll be the first to dig. But maybe you'll be the first to finish." Mark asked if Pike knew about the cabin. He did. Off the grid place. State lines blur back there. Some said he kept it as a getaway. Others said darker things. Armed with a location and a name, Mark plotted his next move. He needed to find out what was buried there, literally or otherwise. But first he returned to the clinic ruins, now little more than a husk. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling collapsed, but behind a filing cabinet, toppled by time, he found a rusted drawer with papers half-burned inside. Among them was a scorched intake form, no name, just the date. May 21, 1946, under notes, barely legible. 4th month denied relationship, requested secrecy, signs of distress. It was Rachel's file. Someone had tried to destroy it, but someone had failed. Mark stood in the remains of the place where his mother had once fought silently for her daughters, and felt something rise in his chest that wasn't grief. It was fury. For the first time, he didn't feel like the boy left behind. He felt like a man following a trail of blood that others had chosen to ignore. And the trail, now clearer than ever, was pointing toward something buried far deeper than he had ever imagined. Something that might still be waiting beneath those trees, near that cabin, in a place Rufus Haynes thought no one would ever return to. After speaking with Mary and discovering the scorched intake form inside the collapsed clinic, Mark knew he had to dig deeper, not just into family secrets or whispers from retirement homes, but into the very foundation of Spring Hollow's history. And that meant one place, the county sheriff's archives. He arrived the next morning, eyes bloodshot and fingers stiff with cold, clutching a worn legal pad filled with dates, names, and cross-referenced details. The clerk on duty, a young woman named Tessa, raised an eyebrow as he listed the years he needed, 1945 through 1950, all incident reports, missing persons files, internal memos, and anything referencing Rufus Haynes or the Monroe family. She hesitated before leading him to a side room lined with dented filing cabinets, each labeled in fading ink. Flood in '63 damaged part of the storage. Mark didn't believe in convenient floods. He began combing through the drawers, eyes scanning pages yellowed with age, many brittle to the touch. Within an hour, a pattern emerged. Records from June and July 1946 were notably thin. The missing persons file on Rachel and Lena Monroe was missing every witness statement except two. One was a generic incident report filed by Sheriff Will Crane, noting the girl's absence and summarizing community efforts. The other was a follow-up form dated 3 weeks later, vaguely referencing no viable leads, case presumed voluntary runaway, but there were no photographs, no maps, no composite sketches, no logs from the search party. Most damning, a notation in red ink at the top of the file read, "Consolidated per request, Chief W. Halpern, Aug. 1946. William Halpern remembered the name vaguely, chief of police at the time, and widely known to be one of Rufus Haynes's closest hunting partners. There were photos in Old Town newsletters of them shaking hands at county fairs, drinking whiskey on the steps of the lodge, and smiling beside bloodied deer carcasses. Halpern retired in 1961 with full honors. No one ever questioned his record. Mark leaned back in the metal chair, bile rising in his throat. Files didn't just vanish unless someone wanted them to. Someone had gone through these records and pulled exactly what mattered most. But as he sifted through a forgotten drawer marked External Medical Accounts Unfiled, he found something that hadn't been purged. A single page, tucked between budget memos, barely legible beneath a layer of dust. It was a supplemental report dated June 22, 1946, and it contained the recorded testimony of a boy named Nathan Twofeathers, age 9, a member of the Choctaw tribe who lived with his grandmother on the southern edge of Spring Hollow. The statement, transcribed in pencil, read, "Saw a girl crying, tied. She was pulled by a big man into the barn. Not our barn, the one near the burned tree. She had something red on her face. I hid. Didn't come out. Heard screaming, then nothing." There was a scribbled note at the bottom in the same hand as the report. "Dismissed, child confused, unreliable witness." Mark's heart pounded. The barn near the burned tree, he knew that place, or at least he knew of it. South of the orchard, past Dust Hill Road, there had once stood an old structure that burned down in the late 40s. Rumors said it was struck by lightning, others whispered it was deliberately set, no one rebuilt it. But it was close to Rufus Haynes's cabin. Too close. Mark took a photocopy of the report, folded it carefully, and left the office in a daze. He drove out toward the southern boundary, where Spring Hollow began to fade into unincorporated wilderness. The terrain was rough, the road nearly overgrown. He parked just beyond the old stone mile marker and began walking through thick grass and twisted underbrush. Half an hour later he found it. The barn was gone. Nothing left but blackened foundations and a skeletal framework half buried under vines. But the earth around it still told stories. Mark circled the site, searching for anything, a broken hinge, a fragment of cloth, a nail, until he spotted a dip in the soil near the back corner, a place where rain had eroded sweetly deeper. He knelt, brushed away leaves, and saw something glint. It was a hairpin, rusted, bent, but unmistakably old. Nearby, lodged in the dirt, was a strip of fabric stained and stiff, the color faded but once likely blue. Mark's breath caught. Rachel had been wearing blue. The pieces didn't scream, but they whispered. He took photos, bagged what he found, and promised himself he would come back with better tools. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the archive and reviewed every case involving missing Native girls from the 1940s. Several popped up. All teenagers, all last seen near roads leading to Rufus Haynes's property. None of their cases had follow-ups. In 2 instances, the family had filed formal complaints against a white man in a gray truck, but no arrests were made. One girl, Clara Running Deer, had vanished in April 1945. Her mother claimed she had taken a job cleaning at a private hunting cabin for a man with shiny boots and tobacco breath. The sheriff's office never investigated the cabin. Mark began building a timeline on his motel wall, pinning notes, photographs, and news clippings. His motel room looked like a conspiracy diagram from a film, but nothing about this was fiction. It was blood and silence and missing girls. He now had the name of a witness, a location, physical artifacts, and a pattern. But every time he tried to reach out for legal assistance, the same answer came back. Too old, not enough evidence, no living suspect. But someone had to know more. Someone had to still be alive, and maybe, just maybe, Rufus Haynes had left behind more than memories. Property records, letters, deeds. There was a paper trail somewhere. Mark needed to find where it led. The discovery of the rusted hairpin and the child witness testimony led Mark to a singular, unshakable conviction. If the truth about Rachel and Lena still existed in physical form, it would be hidden in the one place Rufus Haynes believed no one would ever return to. That cabin in the woods, long abandoned, long erased from maps, was more than a hideout. It was the end of the trail. But by 1985, the land once owned by Haynes had been absorbed into a state-managed conservation reserve known as Pinewell Preserve, a sprawling stretch of uninhabited forest marked by thick undergrowth and loosely maintained hiking paths. Gaining access wasn't easy. Mark petitioned the local environmental board, claiming historical research on pre-war settlement structures. With a little pressure and a borrowed university letterhead, he was granted a temporary exploration permit. He assembled a team of 3. Carla Jenkins, a forensic anthropology graduate, Nate Harlan, a local historian with a deep knowledge of Spring Hollow's land records, and Tony Wenyen, a contractor with experience in controlled excavations. They hiked in early one misty morning, navigating by compass and fated deeds. The map coordinates placed the site about 3 miles east of Dust Hill Road, through a thicket of pines and briars so dense it felt like pushing through time itself. By midday they found it. Half buried beneath moss and twisted vines, the foundation of what was once a single-room structure emerged, a rectangular outline of blackened stone, uneven and fractured by decades of weather and roots. Carola cleared the moss with a soft brush, revealing cut granite blocks shaped in a way too deliberate to be natural. At the far end, a crumpled hearth. Beside it, the remains of what may have been a wooden floor, now little more than mulch. "He burned it down himself," Nate muttered, tracing scorch marks along the outer edge. "Typical of men trying to bury what they can't carry." Mark said nothing. He circled the site slowly, eyes scanning the perimeter for anything left behind. It was Tony who found the first anomaly, a depression in the earth, near the back wall, where the soil seemed looser, darker. Could be a collapsed storage pit, he guessed, but Carla knelt beside it and said, "Or a grave." They began to dig, not with shovels but with gloved hands and brushes, lifting soil gently, inch by inch. It was slow work. Mark's knees ached, his breath caught in his throat as Carla uncovered the first bone, a femur fractured at the shaft. Moments later, another. Soon, 2 skeletons lay partially exposed in the shallow ground, tangled together, limbs bent unnaturally, spines arched as if they had died curled against each other. There was no coffin, no cloth. Just earth. One of the skulls showed signs of blunt trauma, a crescent-shaped indentation above the left eye socket. The other had hair remnants still clinging to the scalp, reddish strands that matched Mark's childhood memory of Lena. Beside the bones lay remnants of personal items, a rusted pin shaped like a rose engraved summer, faintly. Mark fell to his knees, lips parted but no sound escaping. It was hers. He remembered giving it to her for her birthday, saved up from a summer of odd jobs. She had worn it every Sunday. Carla lifted another object from the dirt, brushing away grime. A school badge, still bearing the Rockmore crest. "Rinse them," she said softly. "It's Rachel and Lena." Mac sat back, feeling the air punch out of his lungs. The wind through the trees howled gently, as if in mourning. They documented everything, took photos from every angle, recorded GPS coordinates, then carefully recovered the bones and items to await proper forensics. Mark filed an immediate report with the county coroner and contacted the state police. This time he had more than theories, he had evidence. Within 48 hours, the site was sealed off, yellow tape fluttering around the foundation as forensic teams moved in. Media descended on Spring Hollow like carrion birds, reporters knocking on doors that hadn't been opened in years. The Monroe girls were back in headlines, their names finally spoken not as myths, but as victims. The town buzzed with a mixture of guilt and vindication. But Mark knew the remains were just the beginning. Physical proof answered one question, but birthed dozens more. Why had they been buried there, and by whom? What exactly had happened in those final hours? Who else knew? The location confirmed Rufus's involvement, but not the full story. And then came the autopsy report, confirmed for both girls. Rachel had suffered head trauma, likely from a blunt object. Lena had asphyxiated, her hyoid bone fractured, consistent with strangulation. It wasn't just death. It was violence, intimate and cruel. It was murder. Mark returned to the site days later, standing at the tree line as the forensic team finished their work. One technician handed him a sealed evidence bag containing something recently unearthed, an old metal flask engraved with initials RH. Inside, a folded, water-damaged scrap of paper. Only one line was still legible. "If she tells, we all fall." His jaw clenched. Someone had written it, folded it, and hidden it here. Or perhaps Rufus himself had dropped it, drunk and panicked, during those final moments when the fire consumed everything but the truth. The DNA results arrived within 3 weeks, cold and clinical, the language devoid of the human tragedy beneath it. A match confirmed for both skeletal remains with surviving maternal lineage, Emily Monroe. Rachel and Lena, without a doubt, had been found. 40 years lost, now unearthed in silence. Mark stood in the hallway of the coroner's office, eyes scanning the report he had waited decades to hold. His hands trembled not from surprise, but from the finality of it. The search was over. They were gone. Officially, unquestionably. But when he met with Detective Kearns at the Spring Hollow station later that afternoon, he found no triumph, only bureaucracy. Kearns flipped through the file, sighed, and said, "We can't press charges, not after all this time, not with the suspect long deceased. Rufus Hayne had died in 1979, struck quietly. Rich. Buried beneath a marble headstone etched with accolades." Mark pushed back. "What about the bones? The location? The flask? The paper?" But Kearns shook his head. "It's all circumstantial. No living witnesses. No forensic link tying Rufus to the act. It would never hold up in court." Mark felt the room tilt. So many years, so many pieces assembled, only to hear that the justice he sought had expired with the man responsible. He walked out of the precinct without speaking, his boots heavy against the tile. That night, he returned to the motel, staring at the collage of photos and notes pinned across the wall like a shrine to lost truth. He thought about burning it all, letting it go, but something in his gut held him steady. Justice wasn't always in courtrooms. Sometimes it was in stories, the kind whispered before bedtime, the kind handed down. And sometimes, if you listened close enough, the dead still spoke. The call came a week later. Gerald Pike, the retired reporter who had once tried and failed to investigate Rufus Haynes, reached out with a voice that crackled like dry leaves. "You need to come over," he said. Now, Mark arrived at Gerald's cluttered home to find him pale, thinner than before, eyes Jackson, sat pushing a shoebox across the table. "I got something," Gerald said, pushing a shoebox across the table. "I got something," Gerald said, pushing a shoebox across the table. Inside the box were cassette tapes, old and brittle. Gerald explained that after Rufus's death, a distant cousin named Daniel Haynes, estranged from the family, had approached him with a story. Daniel had grown up hearing fragments of The Summer No One Talks About, and on his deathbed in 1980 he'd left behind a tape. Gerald had filed it away and forgotten it. Mark stared at the label, July 12, 1980D, Haynes. They played it on a dusty recorder, the audio warped but discernible. Daniel's voice was slow, raspy, drugged by illness. "I ain't got much time left, and maybe this don't mean nothing to nobody now, but I gotta say it out loud. I was 16 in 46. Rufus brought me to that cabin once, said it was a man's world, a place to learn. I thought it was just hunting stuff, but one night he came back angry. Said he was dealing with a mess. Said a girl had gotten knocked up, not just any girl, one of those Monroe girls. Said she was pregnant with a baby by someone who didn't belong. Said if folks found out, everything he'd built would burn. He was drunk, Waylon Blacken. Next day, I saw his boots covered in mud, and he told me, 'That girl won't be no problem anymore.'" The tape fizzed with static, then resumed. "I didn't ask questions. I was scared. I saw him burn something out there, something big. I never went back." Mark's throat tightened. There it was, an admission, indirect but damning. Rufus had handled it. Rufus had spoken about Rachel's pregnancy as a threat, and Daniel, a scared boy, had seen the aftershock. Mark made copies of the tape and brought it to the authorities. But once again, the answer was the same. Rufus was dead. There was no one to prosecute. Still, the story couldn't be buried anymore. With the tape, the forensics, and Mark's own decades-long documentation, Gerald wrote an exposé that appeared in the Vesper Times under the headline, "Buried Girls, Buried Truth." The town buzzed with controversy. Some called it closure, others called it betrayal. But for once, the Monroe sisters were not silent ghosts. They were named. They were seen. Mark didn't attend the town council's formal acknowledgement ceremony. He was already gone, driving back toward the ruins, toward the land that had swallowed his sisters whole. He brought 2 wooden crosses, hand-curved, and planted them near the spot where the bones were found. No flowers, no prayers, just the names. Rachel Monroe, Lena Monroe, and below them, one final word, remember. The cold clarity of the truth brought neither celebration nor revenge, but it brought an ending, and sometimes that had to be enough. With the remains identified and the forensic report confirmed, Mark knew his final duty was to bring his sisters home. The idea had been quietly lodged in his mind for years, seeded from a conversation overheard in his childhood, when his mother once whispered to a neighboring tree. That tree still stood at the edge of Spring Hollow Cemetery, gnarled and aged, a silent sentinel watching over rows of faded stones. Mark filed the paperwork for reinterment, signed the necessary permutes, and worked with the town to arrange a proper burial for Rachel and Lena. The ceremony was scheduled for late autumn, when the leaves burned red and gold, and the wind spoke softly between gravestones. News had spread beyond the town limits by then. Journalists had moved on, the headlines faded, but the townspeople remembered. On the morning of the funeral, nearly 80 people gathered, former classmates now gray-hailed, old neighbors, and a few quiet faces who had avoided eye contact for decades. Mark stood by the simple twin caskets, eyes fixed ahead, hands folded, refusing to speak. Words had already been spoken, pages already filled. Now was the time for silence. As the minister recited psalms and soft wind carried his voice across the field, Mark's gaze drifted beyond the crowd, to the back fence, where a woman stood alone beneath the dogwood, hands clasped over her mouth, tears streaking her cheek. She didn't approach immediately. She remained at a distance until the final clods of earth had been laid, until the murmurs of comfort had died down and the others had trickled away. Mark noticed her stillness, her composure cracking under the weight of something familiar. When she finally stepped forward, her posture was unsure, her eyes locked on the ground. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, voice soft, thick with emotion. I think Rachel was my mother." Mark stared at her. She looked to be in her late 30s, dark hair streaked with auburn, eyes the same green-gray as the ones that had once calmed his childhood nightmares. Her name was Eleanor. She had been adopted by a family in northern Missouri, raised with love, educated, and given a life unmarked by violence, but she had always felt an absence, an unspoken rift in her story. 2 years ago she began searching, chasing threads in silence, connecting records and fragments, and eventually stumbled across a hospital birth entry from June 1946, marked only "Infant Feel." The child had been transferred to a home for unwed mothers outside Dunsley and adopted 3 months later. That record had remained sealed until recently, unclassified by a clerical oversight. When the Vesper Times article was published, Eleanor recognized the names. The dates aligned. She knew. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. A niece, a connection, a survivor. They sat together that afternoon beneath the dogwood, a shared silence stretching between them, not awkward, not forced, just filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Eleanor spoke of her adoptive parents, her childhood, the pull she'd always felt toward something unknown. Mark told her about the sisters she never knew, about Rachel's laughter and Lena's wild, stubborn streak, about Emily's fierce love and Joseph's slow unraveling. He gave her the rose pin, cleaned and restored, the only piece of Rachel that had endured. She wept as she held it, tracing the petals with reverent fingers. "I thought I had no family," she whispered, "but now I have roots." They visited the farmhouse together, now vacant, a structure frozen in time. In the attic they found a box Rachel had once kept, childhood drawings, a pressed flower, and a page from a diary dated February 1946. "I'm scared," it read, "but I feel something move inside me, and I know I have to protect it, even if the world tries to take it from me." Elena cried over the page, not because of the pain it held, but because it meant her mother had loved her even through the silence. In the weeks that followed, Mark helped her navigate the legal confirmations. DNA verified the relation. She changed her last name, quietly, without fanfare, to Eleanor Monroe. Together they arranged for a permanent memorial at the gravesite, not just names, but stories engraved. The town changed too. The high school created a scholarship fund in the girls' names. The Conservation Board installed a plaque at the edge of Pinewell Preserve near the ruins, acknowledging the site's history and the lives lost there. Spring Hollow began slowly to confront its past. It was never about forgiveness, it was about remembrance. And in that remembrance, something like peace. Mark, now nearly 40, felt a different kind of stillness settle over him. He didn't leave again. He stayed. He tended the grave. He answered letters from distant relatives, from strangers who'd read the story and wanted to tell their own. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, he'd find Eleanor seated beneath the dogwood with a book, her fingers brushing the earth gently, as if to say, "I'm here." If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries. I'm curious, what do you think really happened during those missing hours back in 1946? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk.